Thank you for joining us this evening for our final presentation in our Natural Framing, the Life and Work of Frank D. Morimoto series. I'm Megan Wilbar, Museum Coordinator for the InfoZone Museum at the Rawlings Library. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Debbie Kagiyama Quakenbush and her program entitled The Japanese American Experience, Colorado and the Voluntary Evacuees of World War II. Ms. Quakenbush identifies as Sansi, third-generation Japanese American. She grew up in northern Colorado, and voluntary evacuation is part of her family's history. Debbie has a BA in History and Ethnic Studies from the University of Denver. Debbie currently works as a librarian at the Joyner Green Valley Library in Pima County Public Library System in Arizona, so she's joining us there from tonight. And now I will turn it over to Debbie. So thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I want to thank you, Megan, and also Aaron Ramirez and the Pueblo City County Library District for giving me the opportunity to give this presentation. And it just seems so very fitting that on the eve of the Day of Remembrance, February 19th is the Day of Remembrance, where we remember Executive Order 9066, that I get the opportunity to talk about a little known group of Japanese and Japanese Americans from World War II that are I put quotations marks around voluntary evacuees. Voluntary evacuees were anything but voluntary. And I would like to go into this because I think it really highlights a much more richer history of Japanese and Japanese Americans in the United States. While camp is a really, really important thing that we must never forget, and the unlawful incarceration of all of those individuals was wrong, and we must not forget that. We also need to remember that there are so many other experiences out there that are contributing to the history of the Japanese American tapestry in this country. So I'm going to start out here, and I will advance my slide. And what I want to do is, as I've kind of already alluded, we're all pretty much, or I'm going to assume that all of us are pretty much familiar with Executive Order 9066. So, and about the forced removal and incarceration of American-born Issei, which are second generation, if you're not familiar with that, men and women, and their sansei, which are third generation children, and then their parents, who were Issei. They were put in barbed wire enclosed camps, and they were deprived of their basic civil rights. So we see a lot of information, and rightly so, about this event. We see all kinds of books, all kinds of stories, but we don't see a lot about everyday life. I mean, we do see it some, but it's including the voluntary evacuees really, really pulls in the other communities that were already pre-existing in the United States. And my research in particular focuses on the northern Colorado area of Fort Lupton. And I did quite a bit of research on this for that. So, we all sit and we think about this whole, everybody pretty much knows this iconic image of this instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry, where Executive Order 9066 culminated in the creation of the War Relocation Authority on March 18th, 1942. So, but what many don't know is, prior to the formation of the internment camps, the United States government tried to get Japanese Americans and their Issei parents to leave the coast and move inland on their own. So we all are very, very, very familiar with these images of people standing, waiting to get onto buses and to be transported to assembly centers and then also to internment camps. But we do not know, most people do not know of the story of the voluntary evacuees who fled but were not put into this process of being loaded onto buses and taken to camps. And it also fails to include, when we don't talk about this, the history of the pre-existing Japanese communities. So this is what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to move to the next slide. So the reason why I'm showing you this picture is that it's very interesting. When I first started doing this project, some people were telling me, I don't know, there's not going to really be very much information on this topic. And one of the things that happened after doing some digging around is I was able to locate one reel of microfilm located in the National Archives, and that reel of microfilm had relocation cards that were filed in it, and they were the relocation cards that were referred to in General John L. DeWitt's final report on the internment camps and the evacuation. I thought that these would be some sort of really, really official sort of card that they had to, go to the military, to a military office or something to fill out. But it turns out that these forms were basically change of address forms that these people would go to the post office and they would fill out. And I have not been able to really determine where, if they filled them out with a postal clerk or if there was a military person there to take those forms. But somehow those forms were taken from the post office and they were given over to the military, and the military was trying to keep track of all of these different people. So part of the reason they were trying to get people to move inland on their own is because they were really hoping that they could remove people from the designated area of military area number 2, which would be unrestricted, get people out of military number 1, area number 1, which was a restricted area. And they were really hoping that they would be able to get Japanese, and there were Germans and Italians too that were not citizens, that they were doing this too as well. They were trying to get people removed from those areas without having to have the camps, okay? But so once I got this roll of microfilm, I went through and I wanted to try to find out where all these people went. And what I found was some of them were really moving around. And so this change of residence report card, this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is literally a change of address card that you would get from the post office. And this particular one, I have 3 cards that are from somebody by the name of Mary Endo. And I'm gonna just kind of scroll quickly through here. But what you're gonna see, I'm just gonna take a few moments, I'm gonna switch over. But when you look, you're gonna see that, let's see, I'm gonna take you back to the front. So right here, March 23rd, this is the card that she changed, she switched or filed. And then you see March 26th, she filed another one because she thought at first she was going to Colorado in the original one. And now it looks like she's going to Keeley, Utah. So clearly there's some sort of upheaval going on here. She's trying to figure out where to go. And so again, I found, as going through all of these cards, I found yet another one for her. And she was actually now going to somewhere else in Utah, but she's going to Salt Lake. So this is just sort of to highlight to you what some of the process that went through for people that were being voluntarily evacuated. And so I went through and I found all of the different people that were going to Colorado, okay, that filed for relocation to Colorado. So this next picture that you're seeing, these are the relocation destinations, okay? And the top 3 destinations were Denver, Fort Lupton, and Brighton. I think the 4th one was Rocky Ford as well. These are all pins that I dropped. There's a really cool kind of map maker at National Geographic, and I just kind of dropped these pins. It's not all of the locations because my geography is terrible, but I was able to find most of them. And what I want you to kind of notice is, okay, so here's Denver, and here's Brighton, and here's Fort Lupton. Those were the 3 largest. But I also want you to really take a look at this, where all of these people were going to. And if you look at this, these are all very primarily, a lot of it is from agriculturally based communities. And most of these people were probably traveling to these areas because they had friends, or they knew people, or they had family that were here, or maybe they had been here prior, and then now with the war breaking out, they were coming back here. So some of you might be thinking, so what's so important about that? So what's really important about this is that we already have like a very dynamic community that's been thriving in the state. We've had lots of relationships that have been built with other community members, and now we have this influx of people that the press is saying is very dangerous. And what is that doing to our community, to the communities that they're going to? So I have a couple of little charts here, and you can just kind of see the number of families that are going to the different destinations. So for instance, there's 175 families that are traveling to Denver. And I took all of this, and I don't want to bore you with how I analyzed all the data, but I took all of the addresses and I matched all of them, and I matched names, and then I also went into archives and I looked at different directories from the 40s to see if I could look up where these different locations were. So it's very, very, very interesting to see that some of them, it looks like maybe some of the single individuals, some of them were going to the Issei Hotel in Denver. There were also people that were getting a lot of their mail at the Denver stockyards. There was also a Mr. Harada, a Sadakichi Harada, and I think he was actually farming sugar beets in the Rocky Ford area. And I believe there were a number of people that were sending or having their mail forwarded to this gentleman. So being able to just take that one little roll of microfilm and taking a look at that, I was able to kind of determine where everyone was going. So you can see at the bottom of this chart here, just all the different cities, and then just from that map that I showed you prior, where people were going to when they left. And here's the number just broken down just with numbers of people as opposed to families. So with Denver, it was 392. With Fort Lupton, it was 306. And with Brighton, it's 300. Rocky Ford, looks like it's about 140, oh, excuse me. Yeah, 142, 43. So just to show you that, you know, there was lots of people, lots of like voluntary evacuees that were coming here prior to Amachi being filled with people that were being interned. We were having people that were fleeing the coast to come to Colorado to seek refuge from the hostility that was being vented toward them after Pearl Harbor. So one of the things that I was able to find out, and actually, full disclosure here, this is actually my grandfather's travel orders. This is, I hope you can read it. I wanted you to be able to see the whole thing, but it basically says application of alien enemy nationality for permission to travel. And what is very interesting with this is that when I looked at the General DeWitt's final report, he referred to the travel papers. He didn't talk about the type of travel form that this is, but my understanding of General DeWitt's book is that it was, or his report was that it was very, very inaccurate, and there were a lot of discrepancies within it. So it was hard for me to determine whether, each maybe locality had their own form or whatnot. But if you look at this, you can see that they want to know where they're going, who they're going to, how many nights they're going to be, their final destination. And they also want to know, where is it, right? The routes that they want to take. So there is this intention here of these individuals that are leaving the coast voluntarily, that people are wanting to know where these people are going. So one of the things I just want to also talk about is, maybe some of you are wondering, well, what is the big deal? Because they're leaving, they're fine, everything's good. They didn't have to go to camp, everything is good. Well, there was a lot of hostility. The military, the U.S. government did not prep the public properly for having any kind of welcome or education of having people come from the West Coast. Their assumption was that, there was a bunch of evil Asians coming inland and that they were going to be expected to take these people. So I also did some research in the archives, and I found some different articles from the Denver Post from around this time, in February 19th. This is a very early period of time. And what you're going to see here is, like, for instance, trek of coast Japs, excuse my terminology here, reaches New Mexico. And that you can see, if you look at this, glance at this article, that there's some very general hostility here. There is some very general hostility here. And one of the things that one of the people, because I went through and I did 10 oral history interviews with people who were voluntary evacuees. I did this, oh my goodness, like in 2003 or 2000, probably about 2003 or 2002. And unfortunately, most of these people have passed now, but I had the extreme privilege of being able to interview Mr. Herbie Noe, and he was talking about his travel through Needles, California, crossing over into Arizona, and this was kind of what was probably referred to as the southern route. And he was 14 years old, and he was in a truck with one of their family friends, and that truck, the window had been broken out by people who were not happy with having Japanese neighbors in California. So they were supposed to be crossing a bridge, and they were ordering everyone to roll up their windows. And he couldn't roll up his window because he had no window. The window had been busted out. Well, when the soldiers saw that, they stopped him and they were telling him, roll up your window, roll up your window. And so he said, I can't roll up the window. So the military officer or the military person hopped on the sideboard and had his gun just sitting there, and he kept the gun on them while they went across the bridge. So, and there was a bayonet on it and everything, I guess. So there was just some real hostility that was being aimed at people. And Mr. Inoue recalls actually hearing on the radio as they were traveling. They would hear little reports from like little local radio stations. Caravan of Japs headed towards this way, or, it was passing through here. And, there were people that were out on the streets. He said they threw tomatoes and rotten eggs and whatever they had at you at the convoy. So they didn't stop except to get gas and order a hamburger. So they also had law enforcement officials that detoured the caravan first into Flagstaff and then into Gallup, New Mexico. And they questioned each member of the caravan, detaining them for approximately 2 hours each time. So some of it was they were trying to separate his grandmother from the family to try to question him. And she was, pretty hysterical, understandably so, because number one, she didn't understand English, and they were trying to explain to them, you need one of us to be with her because she doesn't understand you. She doesn't understand what you're saying. So this is just a little bit of some of the articles that I found. And I also found a little bit, and it shows you that there's just a lot of stuff going on in these communities that people are afraid because they're not getting the right information. They're not getting the type of information that they need so that they can try to understand that these people are not, they're not criminals. They're just, they're refugees. They're refugees. They're refugees from the coast. And so what I also just want to say, and this is kind of tied into a little bit of what's going on right now in this world. And I just want to point out that, for instance, with this little cartoon here, this is right around the time where Governor Carr is letting people know that he is willing to let people come into the state. He was put in a very, very, very difficult position. Not unlike some of the positions that I feel are occurring in the current world today. But he stood up for this, and he said it was the right thing to do. And he lost his election because of that. And, there was just a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. And unfortunately, now, today, I have to sadly say that I feel like that is on the rise, but it is something that has been there, and it's always been there. There's, this is from the Denver Post from March 15th, 1942. And this is, how about a great highway, a real Burma road from the Gulf of Mexico to the Bering Strait? Why not build it with alien labor? And I would include practically all Japanese, using them in vast concentration camps and their women and children in their beet fields of the West. Give them picks and shovels and see that they dig. This plan would stop the breeding of their kind. The women and the children do most of the work all the times. And the editor's note was, I see no objection. Good roads greatly increase the efficiency of labor and add to the rent fund. So I don't want to sound negative, but I do want people to understand that this is something that has been underlying in this country for many, many years. And unfortunately, it's still continuing. So now, what else I would like to talk about is with the people leaving and going to their destinations. How did some of them fare? How was it? How did it differ from people being in camp? Megan, I'm sorry, I just realized that I did not set my timer. Can you just give me a time right now? Oh, maybe she's not there. Okay. So what you're going to find, what I found was, if you look at the different, let me go back here. If you look at the history of agriculture in Colorado, the first known agricultural lease contract that was drawn up for a Japanese farmer in northern Colorado occurred in 1902. Okay, so around in 1903, there were 300 Japanese farm workers in the fields of northern Colorado. Okay, by 1909, 2,100 Japanese worked in northern Colorado, and the Immigration Commission said that there was about 2,600 Japanese working the sugar beets in the state. So these farmers were very, very desirable because they were willing to improve leased land while needing very, very little capital to share their crop. And initially, the early farmers appear to have been largely single, but they also settled along in these different areas along the railway, the railroads right of way. So like in Atwood, in Alt, in Brighton, in Brush, Eaton, Fort Lupton, Fort Morgan. So if we go back and we look at that map, you will see that this pretty much mirrors what the history of agriculture in Colorado talks about. So as you can see, there was a very thriving world for Japanese farmers in Colorado, even in the early 1900s. And so that really kind of accounts for also some of the reasons why there were so many people who voluntarily evacuated to here. So some of the people, when they were traveling and coming out here, they were able to pull their resources together and they could caravan. So then you would see these things like I was referring to with Mr. Inoue talking about these posts of people saying that there's a caravan coming. Mrs. Kimikato, I interviewed her, and she was telling me that for her family, they were able to go the northern route. So Mr. Inoue left at a very early time before they shut down anything, even thought about shutting down voluntary evacuation. And he went the southern route, and she said that they went the northern route because they said it was really, really bad to go the southern route. So they went the northern route, and she said that they didn't have any problems. So it's interesting to hear how people were kind of sharing information and sharing news as people tried to leave, because a lot of them were trying to leave too because they were very worried because their Issei parents, they were worried that they were going to be thrown into jail. So the Issei children decided that it would be safer to leave with them, or other Issei would see their friends or their other relatives being imprisoned, and so they would decide, I need to get my family off the coast. I need to leave. We need to get inland, and we've got a friend or we have family members that can help us. So so that's what they did, and then once they arrived, the things that really kind of differ for the voluntary evacuees is, so when you went to camp, there was a huge disruption of family because you were eating in in a big hall. You did not have the family table that you normally would have to sit and eat around. You had the big showers, you had the latrines, you had an incredible lack of privacy, just a complete upheaval of the family unit. Even though they went in as a family unit, a lot of things did not function like the family unit. So for voluntary evacuees, what happened with them is that they would go and they would arrive at their locations, and what would happen is they would end up having to immediately find work. And one of the conditions, one of the people I interviewed said that, one of the conditions of leaving is that there was an expectation that you would find work. And so they would go out and they would find work, but, they were also imposing upon or, taking up space from family or friends. And so there was this added sort of pressure to immediately find something, find some kind of housing, find somewhere to help. Supposedly, the War Relocation Authority had some sort of special service to be able to help people with money and things like that for these people. But according to the reports that I had, and based on all of the interviews that I did with everyone, no one knew of any of this. It's either that they didn't know about it, or maybe their parents didn't know about it, or maybe they knew about it but they didn't want to use those resources, or maybe they were afraid to use those resources. So, pretty much what they were doing is they, like those mutual aid societies, they kind of banded together and they put together all of their sources so that they could get together and move all of their things. So right now, actually, what I'd like to do is I'd like to see if there's any questions, because sometimes I do feel like I blather along, and then I can continue. Are there any questions?
And if you do have questions, just type them into the chat box of whatever program you're looking at, and Debbie can answer them either now or at the end too, Debbie?
Yes. And we have about how much now? How much time now?
You're at 31 minutes.
Okay. And we can go 45, right?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
So I don't see any questions yet, but
okay,
keep writing them and you'll answer them at the end.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So I probably got a little short on some of the pictures, but I was trying not to get too heavy on all of the pictures that I didn't want to bomb you with too many images. And maybe I should have gotten you a few more. So one of the things that I want to talk about too is that when I did these interviews, one of the things that was really striking for me is that there were two people that were saying that they should have gone to camp, and which really shocked me. It really shocked me. And I think for some people, maybe that's why some people don't talk about voluntary evacuation, because maybe that's just, kind of a taboo sort of thing. And part of the reason why this paper was so interesting, or this research that I did was so interesting, is that I did run into multiple people that said this. And I was thinking, wow, why would they say that would be better? And it has everything to do with everything that I've been talking about. It's about having to immediately leave, having to take everything, just like the people that went to camp. They had to leave all of their possessions behind. They pretty much had to, some people were able to take all their stuff because they were in a financial position and their friends were in a financial position to be able to take all of their things. In other words, for example, I talked to a gentleman who said that his family had friends that they all got together and they actually rented a railroad car and they had all of their stuff transported. Other people, like Mrs. Kimikato, she said that they had their possessions stored away in a room in their house, and somebody was supposed to be watching their house, but then the house, they looted everything out of it, and then the house was burned down to the ground. My father, who was a voluntary evacuee, he was young at the time. Susumu, the travel papers that you saw, that was for my grandfather. They were traveling and their car broke down. So they had all of their possessions and everyone in the car. It was jam-packed full of my aunts and uncles and my grandparents. And they had to take what they could, or the trailer broke down, excuse me. The trailer broke down. And they had to take what they could and stuff it into the car with everything else. And there's a big story about a sewing machine that I'm not going to go into, but everything else got pushed off to the side of the road. And, you know, my dad says somewhere it's still out there somewhere. It just got pushed off the road and they had to move on because people were not going to help you if you were in trouble. People were not going to stop and people were not going to help you. So, you know, there's that kind of trauma. And then just going to other areas where no one knows you, and then going into these communities where there's already a hierarchy or a social hierarchy established. It was very interesting for me to look into the Fort Lupton based upon just looking at the community newspapers. I was able to go to the archives at the University of Colorado at Boulder and see some of the different newspapers. And there was a lot of discomfort with having voluntary evacuees, and then later, as people were being released from camp, having them come into the community because they were feeling like that there was, you know, this known sort of status quo or known sort of structure that was in place, and they were worried that things are going to change or that it was going to make things different. And, you know, you would also see a lot of things that I'm sure you've probably all heard before, that like organizations would like the Japanese language school would disband, or if they would elect Nisei instead of Issei to be like the president of different organizations. And this was all an attempt to be able to show people, you know, we're Americans, and, you know, we're not necessarily feeling really comfortable having people from the outside coming into these communities. Even though they were people probably that were related to them or they knew them, they were coming back under very, 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 very stressful and scary circumstances. So, yeah. So it was very interesting to see how even the Japanese community in Fort Lupton was concerned about having people come in. They actually even had some resolutions made that they would publish in the newspaper about, you know, we really do not want voluntary evacuees coming into the community because we feel that it's going to jeopardize the standing of other people within the community. So, yeah, and also with not going to camp, so they were voluntary evacuees. They were pretty much thrust into immediately finding housing, immediately finding food, immediately finding employment, immediately just getting settled. Again, please do not think that I'm minimizing anything about being put into camp. It's a terrible, horrible thing. But one of the things that you could argue is that you did have an opportunity to go out, like a couple of family members could go and leave camp when they were starting to have people leave camp. You might have like a couple that would leave ahead of time and then kind of get a little bit more established, and then other people would follow. Now, I'm not saying that their transition was any easier than the voluntary evacuees, but it does create a little bit different situation as opposed to having your entire family fleeing with you and then needing to establish a home and work and food and shelter and all of those things. So, make sure here. So, I think that's about all I wanted to say, except for that, you know, in the end, these communities, they they moved through these difficulties. There was hostility, but there were also people that were very, very, very willing to stand by, like the voluntary evacuees. Mr. Inoue told me a story about there was some family that was really wanting to cause some trouble, and the person that they were renting land from, I believe, came out one night and started unloading rifles and guns and said, "Better get ready, people are coming." And they're like, "You got to be kidding me. We don't use guns. We don't shoot guns." And he said, "Well, people are coming, you better." So sure enough, this big truck came, and they didn't shoot anyone or anything, but it was kind of a deterrent. They ended up actually just kind of leaving after that, but they really kind of meant business. But in other situations, people were just very kind. The Russian Germans in Fort Lupton, they were very, very kind. A lot of them were very kind, and a lot of them were very sympathetic. They were like, we're German, but they can't tell that we're German. They can tell that you're Japanese, but they can't tell that we're German. So we understand what you're going through. So I hope this gives you a little bit of an insight of just how rich history can really be, that there can be a tendency for just one narrative, and that there's so many other branches to that narrative, and that it leads us down to a much more richer picture of history. So I hope you enjoyed this, and if you have any questions, please ask. And
Debbie,
thank you.
We do have a question that came in.
Okay.
Someone wanted to know, did voluntary evacuees stay in the area after the war or move back to the West Coast?
That's a good question. So a lot of them did go back to the coast. Some stayed, but a lot of people, kind of like with the people who were in camp, they eventually tried to make their way back. They weren't necessarily able to, go back to the same land or the same home that they had, but they did try to go back. There's a book, I believe, called Farming the Home Place. And I believe that's one of the few communities where a lot of the Japanese were able to go back and really reestablish themselves. But that was not necessarily the norm. Especially with the camp and the instructions for people to disperse, you see a lot of diaspora of Japanese Americans and their Issei parents from that point, because they're trying to go in to the communities and they're trying to assimilate. So does that answer your question, or do you need me to try to clarify more?
It answered it for me. So thank you. And I don't see any others or a follow-up to it. So thank you so much, Debbie. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
All right. And thank you all for joining us as well. And have a good night.